Now that we have discussed custom mechanical keyboard cases in detail, we can move on to the next piece of a custom keyboard, the PCB. The PCB of a keyboard is the electronic part of a keyboard that communicates with your computer to tell it what is being pressed. If you're familiar with building PCs or PC parts, think of it like the motherboard of the keyboard. When building a custom keyboard, there are a couple of things to keep in mind when looking for a PCB. The first of which is whether it's a solder PCB or a hot swap PCB. A solder PCB requires you to solder in the pins of the switches onto the PCB of the keyboard. This requires a soldering iron, solder, the skill of knowing how to solder, and on top of that, this means that the switches are semi-permanently soldered into the PCB. And I say semi-permanently because there are desoldering guns, but it is much more permanent than hot swap. Speaking of hot swap, a hot swap PCB is a type of PCB that has hot swap sockets soldered onto the board, which allows you to just put in and take out any switches you want without needing to solder or desolder at all. This type of PCB is very beginner friendly, and also I just simply prefer it because it makes things very easy to install with very little downsides. The second thing to keep in mind when looking for a PCB is going to be the layout support that the PCB has. When I talked about layout in the previous video, it was referring to the actual size of the keyboard, but even within the same exact keyboard case, there are different layouts that you can use that suit your preferences. Examples of this are split backspace, split right shift, split left shift, etc. As a general rule of thumb, solder PCBs are going to have the most options for layout possible, because with hot swap PCBs, the hot swap sockets on the back of the keyboard take up a good amount of space, and so they can't fit every layout option onto a hot swap PCB. Hot swap PCBs in modern days have gotten a lot more layout support than they used to, but you will still get the most layout options when choosing a solder PCB. So this can be seen as a downside for hot swap PCBs and just something to keep in mind when searching for parts. To wrap things up, I will give my general recommendation that I highly recommend almost everyone to get a hot swap PCB, even if you are not new to the hobby, because I just think they are just better in most regards. And even with that one notable downside, I think that the person that wants that very specific layout choice is already going to know that they want a soldered PCB. The only reason I would really recommend getting a soldered PCB is if you are that person and or you think that learning how to solder would be a fun new thing for you to learn. So with this new information, I'd like to recommend again content creator Alexoda's vendor list as a helpful resource to look for any keyboard kit parts that you might need from reputable vendors.